This Bible study is based on the reading from Exodus chapter 14, verses 19 to 31, one of the lectionary readings for Sunday the 13th of September. If you can read the passage before you listen to the video, that's probably really helpful. So in this passage, we reach the climax of the Israelites' release from slavery and their escape from Egypt. Last week in chapter 12, God gave Moses the instructions for the Passover. And since then, since that reading, the people have done what they were told to do, with terrible consequences for the Egyptians. And Pharaoh has agreed to let the Israelites leave. In fact, the Egyptians want them to get out as soon as possible. We read that in chapter 12, verse 33. And there's an interesting bit that I've never noticed before in chapter 12, verses 35 and 36. The Israelites plunder the Egyptians and take their gold, silver, and clothing. All of this happens before the passage that we're looking at today. Finally, after 430 years in Egypt, to the very day we're told in chapter 12, verses 40 to 41, the Israelites set off into freedom. God leads them on a roundabout route as God is concerned that they may wish to return to Egypt if they face war too soon. But still they're prepared for battle as they take their first experience of freedom in chapter 13, verse 18. God warns Moses that Pharaoh will change his mind at God's direction in chapter 14, verse 4. And God gets Moses to set up camp near the Red Sea. We pick up the story in verse 19, just as the Israelites are about to cross the Red Sea. This is Israel's rite of passage. Through making this crossing, they cease to be an oppressed people and they become a nation. Behind them is Egypt and slavery, and ahead of them lies the wilderness and freedom. Israel enters the channel that God has carved out for them by the strong east wind, in verse 21. They enter that as a terrified and panicking group of refugees. They're fleeing for their lives, and they're probably on an emotional roller coaster after all the times that they've thought they might be on their way, but then Pharaoh changes his mind. Finally, they seem to have a glimpse of real freedom. And almost straight away, they can see that they're not safe at all, but they're still pursued by the Egyptians. By the time they leave the channel through the Red Sea, they are in awe at what God has done, and they have an attitude of faith in God for the miracle of salvation in verse 31. So what God promised Moses at the burning bush has now been proved to be true. God is Israel's saviour and redeemer. We do get a lot of detail about the horrific fate of the Egyptians, and many of the troubling questions that we considered last week about God bringing death are just as applicable here. But there are other emphases too which are important. One of these concerns the weakness of Israel. Just as the moment approaches when their freedom is in sight, the Israelites panic and are terrified at the thought of their own helplessness. They cry out to God in chapter 14, verse 10, and they complain to Moses about leading them into this mess. They accuse him of not listening to them and not allowing them to stay in Egypt and live out their lives as slaves. They think they would be better off in Egypt than dead on the edge of freedom. That's in chapter 14, verses 12 to 13. So we can see here that Israel's salvation has nothing to do with their strength or their cleverness. If God had left them alone, and if Moses had left them alone, they would never have emerged from their shackles. Israel's salvation is completely and entirely the work of God, whose revelations to Moses showed God's concern for the oppressed and God's passion to bring them justice and mercy. The walls of water that hold back the sea can be seen as a metaphor for God's love and grace, which protects and shelters the enslaved and the oppressed. So alongside emphasising the weakness of the Israelites and their inability to help themselves, the passage also highlights God's power. In verses 19 and 20, God positions the symbols of divine power, the angel of God and the pillar of cloud, which also seems to be a pillar of fire that lights up the night, and the fire is mentioned in verse 24. God positions these things between Israel and the pursuing Egyptians. They hold back the Egyptians so that they can't reach the Israelites. And of course, the major symbol of God's strength and power in this passage is seen in the rolling back of the water to enable the Israelites to cross safely. In this passage, even the drowning of the Egyptian army is seen to be an example of God's might, if you look at verse 18 and then verse 27, in which we read that the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea with all its problems. The passage shows us that what Israel could not do for itself was accomplished by God. Israel did not have the strength, courage, or actually even the inclination to do anything about the situation they were in, but God acted for them in their weakness and rescued them from slavery. God didn't do this because Israel deserved to be saved or had anything to contribute to its own redemption, but simply because God is a God of mercy and justice, and God chose to act for them. Later on in Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 8, we can see this quite clearly. We can read, "It was because Yahweh loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors, that Yahweh has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the land of Pharaoh." But Moses too has an important part to play in all this. It's plain to see that what happens is God's work and action, but God doesn't work in isolation or from a distance. So God works through the special person God has chosen to act on God's behalf. In verse 21, we read that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the east wind opened a path of safety. And again in verse 27, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the waters returned, and the channel closed. The result is seen in verse 31. The people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. This is important in showing God's activity in human life in general. God rarely chooses to act independently, but often chooses to act through a person who is willing to put themselves at God's disposal. And it helps Moses too. It confirms in the Israelites' mind that Moses is able to lead them. They may forget about this when Moses doesn't do what they want, or when they feel dissatisfied with their current circumstances, but at this point in the story, it shows them, and probably encourages Moses too, that God's promise to Moses, which was made all that time ago at the burning bush, has been proven to be true. God has chosen Moses, and God has not let him down. If you'd like to think about this passage a bit further, there are some questions to consider. So read through the story again. If you have time, read from chapter 12, verse 21 onwards. Read it slowly and take notice of any words and phrases that stand out. Are there any things that you haven't noticed before? For example, for me, it was chapter 13, verses 35 to 36, as I mentioned earlier. So is there anything in the text that you haven't picked up on before? Imagine yourself as Moses or as one of the Israelites, and think about how you might be feeling at the different parts of the story. How do you identify with the way in which the Israelites move from fear and terror to praise and trust in God? Think of a time when you have been frightened or worried about something. In what ways have you witnessed God's activity during this? How do you respond to the idea that sometimes we don't have the motivation or inclination to escape from the things that seem to hold us captive? Is there anything in your life that you need to make a decision to change today? How do you respond to the idea that God often chooses to work through people just like you and me? Think of a time when you know that you have been used as an agent of God's love, justice, and care. And think of a time when you have experienced the liberation of God through the actions of another person.